fram, fylkingar!
The year is 793 AD. A mist clings to the holy island of Lindisfarne, hiding the terror that approaches from the sea.
They arrive not as diplomats, but as a force of nature. Men who believe their path to Valhalla is paved in blood.
For centuries, the monasteries of Europe were the beacons of peace. Today, those beacons will burn. In the heart of the Viking homelands, the landscape is as brutal as the people who call it home. This is the age of the Northmen, a story of fire, discovery, and a legacy that would rewrite the map of the world forever. Long before they were feared across the seas, the Norse people were bound by the geography of the North, isolated, resilient, and fiercely independent. Life revolved around the cycle of the seasons. Winters were long and unforgiving, demanding absolute preparation for survival. The social structure was built on the thing, the gathering where free men debated laws, settled disputes, and solidified the bonds of the community. But the limited resources of the Fjordlands pushed a younger generation to look toward the horizon. The open sea was their gateway to opportunity. Shipbuilding became their greatest art form. The longship was a masterpiece of engineering, flexible, shallow, and capable of both ocean travel and river raids. As the vessels touched the water, the horizon shifted. For these warriors, the ocean was no longer a barrier. It was a highway to destiny. Navigation was an art of intuition and observation. Without a compass, they relied on the flight of birds, the color of the water, and the position of the stars. The arrival at Lindisfarne was not a random encounter. The monasteries were known to be wealthy, undefended, and filled with silver, gold, and manuscripts, prized treasures for the invaders. The shock of the raid was absolute. The Northmen struck with unparalleled speed, transforming a sacred site of reflection into a scene of chaotic survival. News of the devastation spread across Europe like wildfire. For the Christian kingdoms, this was more than a robbery. It was a divine judgment, a terror from the north. The raid on Lindisfarne was merely the opening movement of a grand, violent symphony. The Northmen had tasted the wealth of the south, and their hunger was far from satisfied. As the 9th century progressed, these sporadic raids evolved into calculated campaigns. The sea rovers were no longer just opportunistic thieves. They were becoming a permanent, terrifying presence. For the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the strategy shifted from defense to a desperate struggle for survival. Monasteries became fortresses, and the clergy prayed for salvation that seemed nowhere to be found. Yet, for the Vikings, the motivation was not solely gold. It was a search for fertile soil, for a place to call home, a quest that would transform them from raiders into settlers. Their expansion brought a clash of cultures that would reshape the genetic and political fabric of Europe. The legacy of the Northmen was about to become permanently etched into the history of the West. The arrival of the Great Heathen Army in 865 AD marked a turning point. This was no longer a raid. It was an invasion intended to conquer and carve out land in the heart of England. York, or Jorvik as the Northmen called it, would soon become the jewel of their new dominion. It was transformed into a bustling international hub of trade and craftsmanship. Within the walls of Jorvik, the Viking way of life blended with the local Anglo-Saxon culture. master craftsmen forged intricate metalwork, creating art that echoed both pagan myths and local traditions. Life in the Danelaw, the region under Viking rule, was defined by a new social order. The newcomers integrated their own laws and administrative systems alongside the existing structures. However, the tension between the Northmen and the remaining Anglo-Saxon kings, particularly those in the west and south, was reaching a boiling point. The fate of England hung in the balance. The conflict culminated at the Battle of Edington. Alfred the Great, leading the remnants of the Saxon defense, faced the Viking leader Guthrum in a clash that would determine the soul of Britain. Guthrum's forces were pushed back, forcing a historic peace. The Treaty of Wedmore established the Danelaw, a clear boundary between the Norse-settled north and the Anglo-Saxon south. With the formalization of the Danelaw, the Viking influence began to integrate deeply into the English language, legal customs, and agricultural practices of the region. Beyond the British Isles, the Viking horizon was vast. Across the North Atlantic, they pushed further than any Europeans had dared before, seeking new lands in the icy unknown. They reached the shores of Iceland and Greenland, establishing self-governing colonies that relied on incredible ingenuity to survive the brutal subarctic climate. The ultimate test of their reach came in the year 1000 AD. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, guided his crew across the uncharted western Atlantic to a land he called Vinland. They found a world untouched by European eyes. Here, the Norse sought wood for their timber-starved colonies and a future beyond the constraints of the old homelands. But Vinland was not a passive prize. The settlers encountered indigenous peoples, leading to brief encounters of trade, followed by inevitable, localized friction. Geography ultimately dictated the end of this western expansion. The distance to Greenland and Norway was too great, and the numbers of settlers were too few to maintain a foothold. Yet the legacy remained. The Viking Age was transitioning into the Middle Ages, and the Northmen had forever altered the map of Europe, from the rivers of Russia to the coast of America. The echoes of the Viking Age did not vanish, they integrated. From the naming of towns to the fundamental structures of English law, the Northmen became an inseparable thread in the tapestry of the British Isles. The linguistic legacy remains most profound. Words we use today for kinship, law, and even the days of the week bear the indelible mark of the Norse tongue. Yet, as the kingdoms of the North began to consolidate into sovereign nations, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the era of the independent sea rover faded into the realm of legend. The sagas, once oral traditions passed around the warmth of the Longhouse fire, were transcribed by future generations, enshrining the heroic and brutal deeds of their ancestors. The legacy of the Longship eventually gave way to the Age of Discovery, but the spirit of the Northmen, the drive to explore the unknown, remains a cornerstone of the human story. The Viking legacy is not merely one of iron and blood, but of a sophisticated cultural synthesis that redefined the northern world. As the centuries turned, the longships were hauled onto the shore for the last time, their hulls repurposed as shelter or left to be reclaimed by the salt and the sand. The warrior ethos did not disappear. It was distilled into the foundations of medieval chivalry and the burgeoning national identities of the North. Yet beneath the modern veneer of these nations, the deep-rooted identity of the Northmen persists, a memory of resilience carved into the very rocks and fjords of their homeland. We look back at the Viking Age not just as a history of raiders, but as a testament to the human capacity to endure, to explore, and to reshape the world against all odds. Beyond the shores of the British Isles, the influence of the Northmen stretched across the continent, carving a path into the heart of Frankish lands, where their presence demanded a new geopolitical reality. The Carolingian rulers, faced with this relentless pressure, were forced to adapt, ultimately offering land in exchange for stability, a decision that would birth the Duchy of Normandy. In this new land, the fierce sea rovers began their transformation. They adopted the French language, the Christian faith, and the customs of the nobility, yet never fully shed their seafaring identity. From these Norman roots, a formidable military aristocracy emerged, one that would soon set its sights across the English Channel, aiming to reclaim a throne they felt was rightfully theirs. The year 1066 looms large in the shadow of this history. It was the culmination of generations of change, a collision of cultures that would define the future of England. The year 1066, the death of Edward the Confessor triggered a power vacuum that shattered the status quo. 3 claimants rose, each convinced of their divine right to the English crown. Harold Godwinson, the newly crowned King of England, barely had time to secure his position before the winds of war blew from both the north and the south. In the north, a massive Viking threat appeared. Harold Hardrada, the last Viking, sought to reclaim the throne his predecessors had once held. It was a race against time for the Saxon king. The Battle of Stamford Bridge would prove to be one of the final bloody chapters of the Viking Age. The speed and ferocity of the Saxon response caught the invaders off guard. Hardrada fell, and with him, the dream of a new Viking empire in England died. But King Harold's victory was Pyrrhic. His army was exhausted, and a new threat was crossing the channel. October 14th, 1066, near Hastings, 2 armies stood on the ridge, the weight of a nation's future resting on the blades of their shields. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and impending steel. William of Normandy, the Duke who would be king, launched his assault. The hill was steep, the Saxon line was iron, and the battle was to become a brutal test of endurance. Hour after hour, the collision persisted. The English shield wall held firm, a static fortress against the relentless mounted strikes of the Norman invaders. Then, a pivot point. A rumor swept the battlefield that William himself had fallen. The Norman ranks wavered, threatening to break. It was the moment England might have saved its crown. But William remained upright. Rallying his broken lines, he unleashed a calculated, feigned retreat, a tactic designed to lure the English from the safety of their hill. As the English line began to falter, the final, inevitable blow fell. The king himself was struck down, his banner falling amidst the chaos of the ridge. With their leader gone, the resistance crumbled into the history books. The victory at Hastings did not just win a throne. It initiated a complete reconfiguration of English society. The language, the law, and the very landscape were to be remade in the image of the Norman conquerors. William, now the conqueror, began his march toward London. He would not rule by consensus, but by the construction of stone fortresses, imposing structures that served as both protection and intimidation. The Domesday Book, commissioned years later, stood as the ultimate symbol of this new control. It was a comprehensive census, a cold assessment of every acre of land and every soul within the king's new domain. The Viking Age had ended, and the Middle Ages had arrived. From the ashes of the Saxon kingdom emerged an England transformed, a country that was now forever tethered to the politics and destiny of continental Europe. The arrival of the Norman dynasty didn't just replace a king, it replaced the elite. Massive tracts of land were redistributed, creating a new feudal landscape where the power of the castle was absolute. Language became a barrier, reflecting the new divide. While the peasantry continued to speak the old tongue, the halls of power echoed with the refined dialect of the Norman aristocracy. Religion, too, was reshaped. Romanesque cathedrals began to rise across the landscape, massive, imposing structures of stone that served as physical manifestations of the church's restored authority. The forest, once a shared resource, was transformed by the king's law into royal hunting grounds. For the common folk, this restriction was a bitter blow to their livelihood and independence. This clash between the new order and the ancient rights of the people would simmer for generations, eventually creating the friction that demanded a new social contract. The legal innovations of this era were perhaps the most enduring. The introduction of the feudal system, formalized through land surveys and oath-taking, bound every level of society in a rigid hierarchy of service. Daily life for the agrarian majority remained a struggle against the elements and the crushing weight of taxation. Yet within these communal bonds, a resilient culture persisted. The market town became the pulsating heart of this new England. It was where the products of the field, the forest, and the artisan's workshop met, fueled by the rising influence of currency. Cathedrals were not just places of worship, they were massive public works projects that required a generation to complete, drawing upon the finest masons and architects of the age. As the influence of the church grew, so did its role as the custodian of knowledge. Monasteries became the centers of learning, preserving both classical texts and the theological foundations of the kingdom. The rise of the Gothic architectural style marked the twilight of this era. Where once walls were heavy and fortress-like, light began to flood the cathedrals through soaring arches and intricate stained glass. For the common villager, the cathedral was more than a place of faith. It was the largest, brightest, and most magnificent structure they would ever behold, a window into the divine. As the feudal system matured, so did the administrative complexity of the realm. The king's courts became more itinerant, traveling the countryside to bring law to the furthest corners of the kingdom. The manor house became the true center of rural existence. It was here that the local lord managed the harvest, dispensed justice, and maintained the precarious balance of power. Winter, however, demanded a different rhythm. When the fields were frozen and the work slowed, the long nights were passed in the warmth of the hearth, keeping the ancient stories and traditions alive. As the 13th century waned, the landscape of England began to change once more. The great stone fortresses that once served to dominate the countryside were evolving into more comfortable, though no less fortified, ancestral homes. Trade routes, meanwhile, were becoming the lifeblood of the growing towns. Merchants arrived from across the continent, bringing exotic spices, silks, and the news of the wider world to the remote English markets. The legal system, bolstered by the crown's need for revenue, became more formalized. Circuit judges traveled the land, standardizing the law and ensuring that the king's peace was maintained, even in the smallest villages.
Education began to stir beyond the walls of the monastery. The early foundations of cathedral schools were beginning to lay the groundwork for a new class of literate administrators and thinkers. But life remained precarious. The cycle of the harvest was the heartbeat of the land, and a single failed crop could spell the difference between survival and starvation for the common folk. As we reach the conclusion of this journey, we reflect on the legacy left behind. The era of the sword and the shield, of castles and cathedrals, paved the way for the complex societies we know today. The struggles of the past, the fight for autonomy, the search for stability, and the relentless drive to improve are the same human impulses that continue to shape our modern world. Though the kings, the knights, and the peasants of this age have long since returned to the earth, their contributions remain etched in the landscape, the language, and the history of our shared human story. We leave the Middle Ages behind, not as a finished book, but as the foundational chapters of a continuing narrative that reaches toward an unknown future.
The history of this era is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. From the darkest hours of uncertainty to the brightest achievements of architecture and culture, it is a story that belongs to us all.